All right, everybody, a little bit of a different setup. Decided to come on outside for this one and enjoy some of this beautiful weather, despite some of the nature that comes with it sometimes. But welcome back, everybody, to again our look in sociology of prisons at Dr. Burton, Orasami Burton's Tip of the Spear. And this is chapter 3, a relatively, again, quick look, insufficient look at this incredible book and this another illuminating chapter. So please do continue as I want to keep advocating, follow up on all the sources and the ideas and the people mentioned, because this video and of course this course will just not be sufficient. What we need are more sustained study, and repeated reading of this incredible book. But for me, what I wanted us to focus on a little bit as we consider the relationship again of prisons to our broader society, the recovered, as he starts off the chapter, the recovered notebook of one of the Attica, written by one of the a member of the Attica rebellion. But this paper that again penned by an unknown hand that looks at the differences between the pragmatists, existentialists, and revolutionary protesters, or the militant minority, which believes that American society is so corrupted by its military-industrial governing class and its imperialist foreign policy that only a revolutionary upheaval could bring meaningful change. So there's these categorized differences in how people were responding to the oppressive conditions, and in categories that largely, I think, relate to today. Pragmatists ask for practical institutional reforms. Existentialists think that they no longer believe in institutional reform and rebel just sort of culturally rather than politically. We see a lot of that today. But most importantly, what I think he's saying here on page 79, what Burton is pointing us to, is that this invitation to engage with the Attica Rebellion's political multiplicity destabilizes its overrepresentation as merely a critique of brutality, a rational negotiation between the state and its subjects, and a demand for prison reform. So this constant theme that the rebellion, as Burton wants us to be clear on, was more than just its often narrowly defined narrative summary and oversimplification. That is, as something where just a rebellion of violence against brutality of certain easily observed and logical demands for reform. And immediately on this page on 79, Burton puts his work in juxtaposition to other popular scholarship that does what he is saying needs to be abandoned, which is just completely to rely on dominant narratives and state-sponsored or state sources for information on what happened in Attica, and as we should take to mean as what happens in the world today and everywhere and everywhere else. That is, we should be weary of state-sponsored analyses and critiques, even as we have to be careful of the minefield of alternative theories that are promoted in today's media environment. But his point that state-sponsored sources that tend to de-radicalize the prison movement are part of the problem that Burton wants us to consider, and he does so well at addressing. As he writes on page 80, our collective understanding of Attica and Black rebellion more broadly is further impeded by an apparent need of an analyst to pander to white audiences that devalue, criminalize, and assail complex and protracted Black insurgency while craving explosive spectacles of Black suffering and death. This is a major problem in our media world today, but certainly something that Burton is correct to identify as it relates to the specifics of prisons and Attica. The audience, the appeasing of a white audience that is often the target for these media is part of the problem that inhibits our analysis of these situations. And I think in our analysis of what we might do today to get ourselves out of this mess. So Burton, by centering the stories and analyses of the imprisoned and of radicals themselves and of people in the movement, in the struggle, as he says, corrects the misleading state-centered approaches that predominate the historiography. And historiography just means what is written about a subject. So all that is written or said about a subject is considered the historiography. And because so much of it is state-centered, it inhibits our ability to understand what's going on. But as he says here, Burton instead centers a revolutionary abolitionist black speculative futurity. That is, what does the future, what can a black radical future actually look like? And that's what they were most interested in. That is the Attica Rebellion, those involved in the Attica Rebellion. And the broader revolutionary struggle to which Burton, again, reminds us or lets us be aware of, that the people in Attica were connected to. That is, the rebellion inside was connected to politics and movements outside and happening around the world. And as such, they took on a certain politics and a desire for a world that doesn't necessarily exist, or hasn't been conceived of yet, rather, a future world for a radical new humanity. So this is why I think it's so beautiful that Burton talks about this black commune that they look to create, what George Jackson called the black commune. Thinking black radical and revolutionary formations across time and space, pre-colonial African communities, Maroonage, that is the Maroons, and when they escaped enslavement, what did they set up? In the era of chattel slavery, the semi-liberated zones of Guinea-Bissau and Mozambique, the surviving pending revolutionary programs of the Black Panther Party. George Jackson theorized the black commune as an autonomous site of self-organization capable of nurturing revolutionary culture and alternative modes of collective life. The bleeding edge of the rebellion was not a demand for inclusion and recognition, but for escape, resurgence, and autonomy. It was an internal demand for a complete divestment from the norms of white culture, liberal capitalist ideology, property relations, and respectability. Angela Davis compared Attica to the Paris Commune, which emerged exactly a century earlier, and what Karl Marx wrote of the 19th century Paris is equally true of Attica. The great social measure of the commune was its own working existence. By demonstrating a new world, they could create one. And they could create one by demonstrating one. But again, Burton is taking us out of the internal horrors of the prison and the specifics of that and those narratives to get us to see that these rebellions and what was happening to the prisoners by the state it was itself connected to the broader imperial design of the West and Western man, as Burton talks about. And on page 86, when Burton is talking about these brilliant revolutionary figures who deserve more attention and time, like Sacagawea and Hicks, Tommy Kilimanjaro Hicks. On page 86, when he's talking about, that is Burton, he talks about the uprising and Hicks's stance against these guards and what happens to Officer Quinn, who becomes the representation of empire in the state, and also the fragility of empire, as the guards, when faced with the rebellion, cowered and cried and fell apart, much like has often been talked about the United States and elsewhere, other empires, as the paper tigers. And I think this is a brilliant point, that the violence of the state, the violence of the carceral experience is a mask for the fragility and the fear that those in power have of those they continue to oppress. I thought of that point again on page 94 when Burton is talking about the goal to criminalize and portray the rebels as warmongers and this issue of fragility. We're seeing it play out right now in LA. Trump calling out the National Guard and the Marines. Yes, he may have other other goals of political machinations and other interests, but one of the clear signs to me is that this is a symbol of the fear that those in rebellion represent to those in power, and that those in power, one of their first methods of recourse, or the first points of recourse or response, is to dip back into that bag of military violence, or what Malcolm X used to say, the police do locally what the military does internationally, except now the military is being brought back in to do nationally what it does internationally, that is suppress dissent and make room for colonial conquest and corporate takeover. And again, on page 97, back to this point that I think that to me is so important, and that I love that Burton draws out in this book, is that so much of this carceral and violent repression of prison repression is about the suppression of dissent and rebelliousness and the ideas of rebellion, the consciousness around rebellion. So on page 97, when he talks about the legendary Assata Shakur, who's still living relatively free in Cuba, despite every attempt of this country to track her down and hunt her down and bring her to so-called justice, when Burton says in her opening statement during the trial for the killing of a New Jersey state trooper, Assata Shakur, perhaps the best known member of the Black Liberation Army, describes the origin and the nature of it. And this is again on page 97. And she's talking about the idea of a Black Liberation Army emerged from the conditions of Black communities. The concept of the BLA arose because of the political, social, and economic oppression of the Black people in this country. The BLA Army stands for freedom and justice. It is a symbol of freedom and justice. Again, something to be communicated and from the perspective of those in power in the state to be suppressed. There's so much more brilliance in this chapter alone, but I want to just wrap up here with two relatively quick points. One that is made beginning on page 104, and this sort of radical approach to humanhood and manhood. And I love what Burton does here, especially given the time that we're in today, where there's been an attempted, and still needs to be an attempted, recourse in terms of how we engage women and femininity. But I love the fact that he points out here that when these prisoners called out, "We are men, we are not beasts, and we do not intend to be beaten nor driven as such," Burton I think does a really important job of saying, look, this is not some retrograde manosphere attack on women and a call for the mythological alpha male and all that nonsense. And it is nonsense. Maybe we should have separate conversations about that. But what Burton is talking about here is that he said, as he says, by asserting their masculine humanity in a radical defiance of institutionalized dehumanization, the Attica rebels extended a long tradition of Black radical and revolutionary discourse. The politics implicit in this form of rhetoric have been roundly criticized for their alleged neglect and or hostility towards feminist and queer approaches to liberation, their ostensible endorsement of Black patriarchy, and for enacting an assumptive logic that necessarily disqualifies dehumanized, dominated, and or feminized subjects from manhood and radicalism. It is certainly true that the Long Attica Revolt emerged out of a social context in which the very real problems of sexism, homophobia, misogyny undermine the integrity and dynamism of movements. However, if we understand that Black manhood has never been a stable phenomenon, and that per Sylvia Wynter, white Western bourgeois man overrepresents itself as if it were human itself, then we must ask, what kind of men were the Attica rebels proclaiming themselves to be? And this is where I think Burton begins to brilliantly complicate this question of manhood and humanity. He later writes on page 10, going back to this point, the manhood that they proclaimed and enacted subverted norms of masculinity rooted in white bourgeois ideology and colonial patriarchy. So yes, it may initially sound like a retrograde, just the standard, we refer to humans and with the default of the masculine and the patriarchal reference to men. But what Burton, I think, does here is it adds a complicating layer to that and saying, look, we understand. And then he talks about in some detail here, the intimacy, the gender and sexual play that is not play as in being playful, but in manipulating the boundaries of what it means to be man, masculine, human. And it's much more revolutionary and internationalist and in many ways feminist and queer affirming than it is some retrograde manosphere, alpha male nonsense. And yet the people they're talking about, even those gendered as queer or somewhere else on the spectrum, did every bit of what we would often identify as the most masculine of revolutionary activity. And we're willing to engage in that. So it's a beautiful complication that Burton adds here, something that he builds on in successive chapters, and we'll come back to. The last piece I just wanted to touch on as he ends this chapter with is this point about internationalism and the understanding that in terms of, for instance, calling for expatriation of prisoners to so-called third world countries, to recognizing that this prison struggle was part of a global anti-colonial struggle, where they take a stand, where Al-Jundi wrote, when they take a stand against imperialism, they're taking a stand for the benefit of prisoners. His conception of domestic prisons as central to global empire embeds the revolt within the broader traditions of anti-colonial nationalism. And then you could see where, from George Jackson, of course, who was the in many ways the symbolic figure that launched this rebellion, but to the rebellion itself, revolutionaries from Cuba, Vietnam, and other so-called third world movements all recognized what happened, this Attica rebellion, as being a revolution, an abolition, a decolonization, as Burton concludes the chapter on page 115. So again, what I think this chapter and what this book does brilliantly is it is forcing us, demanding that we revisit and rethink how we interpret and understand prisons and their function in maintaining all of us, if in nothing else, a conceptual prison of our own, as it relates to concepts of freedom, gender, sexuality, humanity, liberation, democracy. All of this was touched on just in this one chapter alone, even as he talks about during the rebellion how there was an enacted democracy that represented pre-American forms of democracy and what should be seen as a post-American form of democracy. That is, what happens after this current form of America fades or is pushed into the history of humanity. What new forms of democracy can emerge? All of that is being discussed in this. So anyway, all right, everybody. Hope you definitely let me know what you think of this video. Hope you got something out of it, and hope it helps you along with your reading and into the next chapter as we get into chapter 4 and gender wars. But yeah, see you next time. Peace.